Despite the risk of cross-border tariffs, declining levels of business investments, and a manufacturing downturn, this country's most recent jobs report showed remarkable resilience. Indeed, the unemployment rate fell to 3.5%, the lowest in half a century. So is it any wonder that more and more investors, analysts, and journalists are paying particular attention to how a company manages the people it employs? I'm your host, Al Dominic. I'm in New York City talking with Matt Sinner, a managing director at Semler Brossy Consulting Group, and Kelly Hennekens, the head of Americas for NASDAQ Center for Corporate Governance, about the impact of human capital concerns on leadership teams at public companies and fast-growing private ones. Matt and Kelly, thanks for joining us here in Times Square. Let's dive right into this topic of human capital reporting. Specifically, what is it and who would be most interested in it?
Well, there are a number of topics that fall into human capital reporting, and investors are interested in it. The SEC, private investment groups, and it covers a variety of different areas, from pay equality, diversity, succession planning, sometimes environmental, social, and governance issues. There are about 10 or so different topics that traditionally have not received a lot of attention from public company boards, and they're through the outside investors and other pressures from the SEC, we're starting to see more and more of these broad-based issues come to light with the board as opposed to just executive compensation.
Sure.
And if I may add to that, one of the things that I think is so dramatically different from, say, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago is the amount of market value that is attributed to intangible assets. And that is predominantly driven by people. It's all about people. How are your people driving innovation? How are they driving growth? Corporate reputations, trust, that is a reflection on the people and of the people. What is the company and how are they driving value in these really critical areas, especially when you're seeing the proportion of intangible assets increase over time. I think we're looking at least 50% of market value now, in some cases over 80%. This is a huge potential resource and avenue for long-term growth for the company. It's also a potential hazard with regards to risk oversight considerations. So we're seeing companies, as well as institutional investors, to Matt's point, look at ways to put numbers around human capital. How do you measure it? How do you disclose it? How do you manage it? And how do you use it to drive long-term growth?
Yeah. Matt, you talked about 10 things that may not have gained attention recently. Could you maybe talk about 2 or 3 of them?
That would be things like diversity,
Okay.
Skill sets in the workforce, pay equality, succession planning. There are a variety of topics that really haven't been at the board level. Even taking polls of your employees and reporting out, how the company is evolving over time. And as Kelly said, there's a significantly increased risk associated with all of these areas because more and more you're seeing investors pay attention to them and the media.
Okay. So, Kelly, is the push for disclosure driving companies' responses?
I think that's part of the conversation for sure. So you've got the Human Capital Management Coalition, you've got the workforce disclosure initiatives and so forth. You've got, to Matt's point, petitions at the SEC. There's a lot of conversations around this area, partly because not only the financial and operational value that human capital management can bring to a company, especially if that's aligned to company strategy, but we're also looking at how is a company positioning itself in the competitive environment in terms of the war on talent, things like that. So it comes down to, I think, how is a company thoughtfully making use of its policies, practices, and also to some extent data mining to best harness, capture, and retain, attract, and inspire its employee base to innovate and spur growth for the long term. Can it be disclosed? Yes, but how do you do it? It may vary from company to company, industry from industry. And I think one of the things we're seeing in the market is different market participants trying to come to consensus on what type of framework would be most useful and what type of metrics might be most useful to a broad range of institutional investors, as well as to the companies themselves.
Sure. Matt, would you add anything to what Kelly just shared?
I would just say that company size right now matters quite a bit. With our larger, we're seeing larger companies move into this much quicker than smaller companies because they have limited resources with respect to the board and the committees and time, and they don't have as many internal resources to basically focus and condense the information down to something that board members can digest. So we're not seeing a groundswell of these things coming up, but it's either the larger companies or it's companies where a director's on one board and sits on another board and sees something that he or she really likes, as far as the type of reporting out done on these metrics, and it's slowly moving from board to board to board.
Gotcha. Well, human capital is a very broad spectrum, but what are some of the issues that have seen maybe the most momentum? Is the compensation committee changing to include oversight of some of these responsibilities?
That's a really great question, and if I could take the second one first.
Okay.
One of the things I think is really interesting to hear in the market is compensation committee members talk about how historically they focused on the pay, selection, performance of the CEO and the named executive officers, the most senior folks at the very top. And more, it's as though their job requirements has evolved to cover more traditional human resource topics. You're seeing more engagement with the chief human resources officer. You're seeing a deeper dive into the different components of what makes the company tick. So absolutely. Examples of topics or metrics might be hiring. So I mentioned hiring, attracting, retaining, and training employees. You've got metrics. Even I think there's a number of them out there. Perhaps the most attention that we're seeing in the market is on employee engagement. Mm-hmm. To what extent are employees actively participated, invested in the company, and committed to the company? That, of course, is probably the trickiest metric to try to get your head around and to get the best quality data out there.
Sure.
And we are seeing more and more companies share their employee-wide polls with the board, boiled down, but basically covering key areas around engagement. And then they're comparing year over year and trying to adjust how the company is managed and led, and the type of training that people get, and the whole culture in some cases, to get positive results year over year.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we also see that I've been seeing a lot in the boardroom has been companies looking at wanting to know about pay equality. That's very big right now. Diversity on boards. Companies are ISS and Glass Lewis and a lot of institutional investors are pushing for more diversity on boards. That's not necessarily trickling down into the management levels yet. One thing I find really interesting, and Kelly made the point that our intangible assets are so valuable and becoming more valuable, yet there are so few people with HR backgrounds on boards or on compensation committees. Mm-hmm. And if this really is such a valuable asset, the question is, why don't we have more people with that skill set on boards?
Yeah, well, that actually opens up a good question, which is really about the board itself. Should the board of directors be working more closely with the HR function in a company?
We're certainly seeing a lot more of that. One of the things I think was really interesting from a research piece we did back in June was to see that, over half of the companies highlighted the importance of human capital management in their communication to their institutional investors through the proxy statement. They're highlighting it in a letter to shareholders. They're highlighting it in terms of director skills and qualifications. And to Matt's point, we saw that in our review of the S&P 100, there was only about 20%, maybe a little bit over that, in terms of companies that say they had those skills within the boardroom. Mm-hmm. But you're certainly seeing more focus and attention. 70% of the compensation committees that we looked at included a focus on people, talent. Maybe half of that, maybe a little over half of that, focused on people more broadly beyond that traditional scope of CEO and the named executive officer. So it's happening. We're seeing it live. Yeah.
Well, so Matt, so then if you're not doing it right now, how would you see developing this in the future?
Well, the way we've been talking to compensation committees in particular about it is we take the 8 to 10 different topical areas in this area in the human capital metric reporting, and decide who's going to be responsible for what. So you may have basically a matrix, and you'd have pay equality. Okay, HR is going to do that, or they're going to hire a consulting firm to do that. And the most important part is that you're not dropping the ball on any of them. So it may not be that you need a director with skills, but you're supplementing with either consultants or other types of advisors to make sure that you cover all of these areas.
Sure.
If I can add to Matt's point, one of the things I think is really interesting is there's a huge amount of attention with regards to board composition, director qualifications, their skills, their expertise, their backgrounds, and diversity. You're seeing, and to Matt's point, you're seeing more of that focus go to the broader employee base. I should just call it the workforce, because you're talking about profiles, age, gender, race, minority, a slew of personal characteristics and background, as well as type of worker, mode functionality, full-time employee, contract worker, type of worker, and what the end goal is ideally to provide for a framework where your best employees can innovate and succeed and take the company that way, just all the way up, and to what extent can you protect workers as needed against, just to provide for workforce safety assurance and confidence that they can do their jobs to the best that they're able to, and that they will be compensated fairly and appropriately and equally.
Yeah. Well, you've given us a lot of food for thought, and we appreciate you spending your time. Matt, Kelly, thanks for looking ahead on these issues around talent and how the teams can work. I'm Al Dominic. Thanks for watching this episode of Looking Ahead.